Drew Bailey, thanks for coming in and talking to me today a little bit about your research and our doctoral program. And so maybe a good place to start, Drew, would be to talk about kind of this focus of your recent research on the issue of fade out in math performance tied to educational interventions. Can you help unpack that research a little bit for us?
Sure, yeah, no problem. I don't know, the way I think about it a little bit autobiographically, in grad school and in my postdoc, I was interested in kind of a popular question of, what developmentally, what are the predictors of high or persistently low math achievement, and if the farther you can go back, presumably the better. And there's this really robust finding. We found lots and lots of other people have found over and over that the children's early math achievement, or sometimes specific aspects of their mathematical cognition, is the best predictor. You can control for everything else that you have, and socioeconomic status, other things the kid knows, aspects of the kid's context. Their early math achievement seems to be a really good predictor of their much later math achievement. And it was sometime during my postdoc when I started to wonder, what are the implications of this for intervention? I think it's kind of sad that I didn't really know nearly enough about the research in which someone had randomly assigned a bunch of kids to either get a math intervention or not, and then follow those kids up many years later. And of course, to the extent that our research was informative about the effects of these interventions, we would predict that there would be pretty big effects, many years later on kids' math achievement from an early math intervention. And when I started to look into this literature, which is, there's a lot of it, and the results look quite different. First of all, it's pretty rare that people get followed for many years after the end of a successful early intervention. But for studies where people get a specific kind of academic educational intervention, not necessarily like a full year in a different educational context, but more knowledge in a particular domain, a couple of years later, usually the people who were randomly assigned to get the intervention and the people who weren't, you can't really tell them apart statistically. And that made me wonder, what does all this stuff mean that I learned before, and why wasn't I aware of this intervention research? And can we reconcile these two areas of research? And then kind of worried and unsure, I got here, and it just so happened that Greg Duncan in the School of Education here had been invited to give a keynote talk at the Society of Research on Educational Effectiveness on the long-term effects of interventions. And he, having looked at this experimental literature for a long time, had grown interested in the topic of why do effects get smaller after the end of an intervention, and of course, perhaps more importantly, why did they sometimes last? And so we went for many walks around the circular campus here at UC Irvine, arguing about why this might be true, and what are the implications for things that we could teach children that might lead to more persistent effects. Does it matter that there's fade out? Are there things that we can do after the end of an intervention to make things better for those kids, et cetera.
What are some of the hypotheses out there about
Sure.
kind of, is it measurement error? Is it, what are some of potential explanations for this fade out?
Intuitively, a common thing that people think is it's just all forgetting. You teach kids, some things, and then they don't practice them, and then they forget them. And that may be true in some educational contexts. Like it may be true, for example, in higher education. Sometimes, if it's a course that the student never uses ever again. But we're interested in fade out primarily in the context of earlier educational interventions, and I don't think that explanation is complete. And the reason is that after the end of a successful, let's say, preschool math intervention, where children are learning, they're about how to count and add and conceptual understanding of the number line and what numbers mean and things like that. You got to use that stuff forever. If certainly in kindergarten
years.
math and in first grade math and in second grade math. So intuitively, there are strong theoretical reasons to think, right, that giving children an early boost on these skills will lead to persistent, long-lasting effects. So, one point that we realized that shows up over and over in the literature is that children who don't get the intervention, of course, in the case of preschool math, they learn these things too. Okay, usually within a few months or a year or 2 years of after the end of the intervention, the people who got the intervention received their intervention. So it's not that the people who receive the intervention are losing skill. They continue to grow. The control group, the people who would have gotten the intervention, are just learning more quickly.
Mm-hmm. So it's not fade out at all. It's catching up.
Catch up, yeah, right. A lot of people have said that if fade out is an inappropriate word, we should use the word catch up instead. I think it's kind of a debate about definitions. I like the term fade out because it's a more general term. It can refer to diminishing effects after the end of an intervention, even when the control group isn't catching up, which does happen sometimes, like in adulthood and for some types of skills. But yes, in early childhood, fade out and catch up can really be happening at the same time.
Yeah. So you can affect the timing of when these skills are developed, but eventually the distribution ends up looking the same because it's driven by these larger structural factors. Right. So what is driving these kind of persistent individual? Like, why does children's early math achievement predict their later math achievement if it's not also true that changing children's early math achievement has similar sized effects on their much later math achievement? And that's a much harder question, but it's one, of course, I'm very interested in. The educational implication could be that maybe we could change those early things, and I think the best candidates for them, are probably things like obviously like contextual factors that are persistent through development, the child's family and schooling environments and things like that, and also personal factors, the child's, working memory capacity, motivation, et cetera. So to the extent that we have good ways of changing those things, maybe those could be targets of intervention. But another reason I'm interested in that is, to the extent we understand what's really driving these associations, maybe we can do a better job of predicting, of forecasting. What if we change this skill hypothetically, given these data in which there was no intervention, what would the effect be 5
years down the road on children's math achievement or literacy skills or interest or something like that. And so that's another problem that I and Greg Duncan and Jade Jenkins and some others here at this school have been interested in.
This line of work obviously has implications for around policy. I think right off the bat of kind of all this investment that's being advocated and is occurring in early childhood education. Could you speak to that or kind of connect your research to some of the policy decisions we're facing in that domain?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting idea. I am maybe a little bit skeptical about the policy implications of this research so far. Not necessarily optimistic about everybody else's solutions, but I don't think that I have a great alternative solution either. I mean, some problems are. And by problems, I mean research problems, not social problems. So we know that there are these famous early childhood interventions, like the Perry Preschool Project and the Abecedarian Project, where children are randomly assigned to receive a year or more of high quality early childhood education, or not, or business as usual.
And these were done in the 60s,
yeah,
and
that's right.
And with large effects, if I recall.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. The effects at the end of the 1 year of preschool are really big on a variety of academic outcomes, IQ scores, achievement test scores, some measures of social skills, although the measures of those weren't quite as good at the time. And then in Perry Preschool, there's kind of this famous finding that the effects on IQ faded out. In Abecedarian, the effects on IQ get smaller afterwards, but they don't fade out completely. And then in both studies in adulthood, there are some impressively sized effects on adult outcomes. In Perry Preschool, on things like incarceration and health, and in Abecedarian on educational attainment and
for the larger audience, I think it's probably useful to pause for a second and just kind of describe a little bit what the nature of these programs, actually was, rather than, it wasn't just math intervention, right?
Exactly. Yeah, right. So it's not just giving children an extra dose of math lessons in the day, or teaching them to read a year before or 3 months before they otherwise would have. It's an entire basket of services. In Abecedarian, I believe there was a registered nurse on site, at all times. Children would probably receive higher quality health care, just child care in general, right? So in Abecedarian, I think it was for like 50 weeks a year, full day care, right? So you're changing people's lives, substantially during the course of the intervention, and that, of course, that's important. So I don't doubt that those effects are in adulthood from those programs are real, and I would be hesitant to say that our research, which has primarily focused on the effects of early academic interventions, where people in the control group are also going to school or some sort of they're in some sort of educational setting, are practically relevant to the question of whether we ought to be funding things like Head Start or state-funded pre-K. On the other hand, I do think I see our research as more important to researchers of those types of programs. If the causal effect of learning a little bit more math early on isn't, given current settings, really big on much later math learning, then why did those early classic programs have such large, impressive effects on adult outcomes? I'm not sure we totally know. And when we learn about those processes, what can we do those have implications for the programs that are currently being funded, for in early childhood education? The other thing, I think, policy-wise, that our research might have implications for is helping to identify possible environments after the end of an effective early childhood intervention that might make the effects of the early intervention more likely to persist into later schooling and possibly into adulthood.
So it seems to me like a lot of this line of work that you're engaged in really kind of interrogates this idea of kind of the meaning of these associations we identify and the statistical patterns we identify, and kind of brings up kind of a lot of these larger concerns people have, or researchers increasingly are paying attention to, around causal inference. So can you connect? How does causal inference come up in this work?
No problem. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that lots of viewers or people interested in the School of Education are really interested in the practical educational implications of these things. I feel like I know so little about those, although I know they're very important. The problem, I feel like, is more directly influenced by this research, or illuminated by this research, is this question about causal inference. We have these two groups in educational research: people doing research on these non-experimental longitudinal studies where people are tracked for many years, and we give them tests or surveys or things like that on a bunch of academic and personal types of variables. And we look at correlations between these measures at different time points. And this other area of research where we try to make things better, we randomly assign people in some cases to receive some sort of educational intervention, and then ideally follow them for a long time afterwards. And it's really too bad, I think, that there's this well-meaning norm in developmental psychology or educational psychology where we're not using experimental data, to avoid ever using causal language, especially in the results section of the paper. You say, early counting knowledge predicts, much later
It's
math
associated with.
is associated, exactly, yeah. Which is is accurate. It's an accurate description, and it's a totally well-meaning norm. We don't want people to totally overstate, to go way beyond their data and say, and therefore there's a causal effect of early counting knowledge on later achievement. On the other hand, I think that an unintended consequence of this strong social norm against using causal language is that people don't really think very much outside of a statistical context about what these numbers mean. Okay, so there's a correlation or a partial correlation adjusting for a bunch of other variables between early counting knowledge and later math achievement of 0.2 or something like that. What does that number mean? well, it's the slope of some line. That's technically that's true, right? And kind of boring. But what theoretically does it mean? Does it have any meaning outside of the context of statistics? And um, I think that people. Part of people think that the answer is yes, and the reason I think that is that in those same papers that make these claims about that report correlations between measures of children's achievement earlier and later, um, very often in the discussion section at the end of the paper they say, and a limitation of the study is that we can't say anything causal at all, but doesn't it really suggest we should be it's really important to know counting early.
The subtext implicit throughout the whole logic of the design is this assumption of causality.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting sociological phenomenon. It's not. I don't think it's people. Trying to trick the audience at all. I think that people hold perhaps incompatible beliefs about the way to write about research and about what the numbers mean, and what they mean for policy. Because if that result means we need to teach children how to count earlier, then it must mean there's a causal effect of children's counting on their later achievement. And so, I'm interested in. I'm not interested in encouraging everybody to just do find and replace in all of their papers and replace predict or associated with cause and effect. I think that would be bad. But I am interested in using causal language when we describe the goals of our papers, of our research.
The motivations for the research and the research design in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. The thing that I am trying to estimate in this paper is the causal effect of a hypothetical intervention that changes children's early counting ability on their later on their much later math achievement. This is something that Greg Duncan has really influenced my thinking about. And not to just merely run the same analysis and assume and say, okay, this is my best guess, but my hope is that if we change the norm, which I think is more already the norm in economics, but not the norm in developmental psychology, I think if we change the norm toward the use of causal language, it might encourage people to come up with ideas about how to more strongly test their theories. Okay, well, if this is really the causal effect of counting on later math achievement, then if I run the exact same model predicting later reading achievement, do I get the exact same estimate? If so, we should be worried because it's less clear. I'm not saying learning how to count isn't going to help you read later, but the effect should be smaller, right, theoretically. And the effect of learning how to count on learning how to add in the next year should be bigger than the effect of learning how to count on learning algebra in ninth grade, because they're more they're closer to each other proximally. We know from the experimental literature that these effects seem to, on average, decay quite a bit, especially in the first year following the intervention. The use, bringing causality into our research introduces us to a whole other world of ways of validating our measures and models and hypotheses and theories. And ideally, this is probably overly optimistic, something I'm rarely accused of being, but is ideally it would kind of unite people doing these two types of research, non-experimental and experimental research on children's early academic achievement. It would allow them to talk to each other in a precise language about causal effects, which is, I think what we're all interested in to some extent.
Yeah, well, being more transparent and explicit about the logic of what one is attempting, kind of, can not only help kind of bring these different communities together in terms of the discourse, but also, like you said, has implications for the kind of analysis you would want to do with that observational data.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Gets us back to the epistemological differences on kind of how we think about these
absolutely
questions and finding out answers to them.
There's a total analogy to the math development research. How much of so we know that children who come into school who have higher math achievement on average are the children who leave school higher on math achievement, right? And how much of that is because of luck, whereby having a kindergarten teacher who spends a little bit more time on math, or just becoming interested in some TV show or game that happens to have more math features, right? Leads somebody to have this early advantage, and which persists throughout development and unfolds, right, in this kind of path-dependent fashion, versus things that are consistently pushing a child ahead or holding them back throughout this long developmental period, like difficulties at home, or a love for math, or something like that.
Well, great. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing with the audience a little bit about your research and the exploration of these larger questions around doctoral training and knowledge.
Well, thank you. It's been fun. Yeah.